Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have our Mox Pearl patron Nick, piloting Talion, the Kindly Lord. This is a Dimir control deck looking to disrupt opponents while getting advantage through its commander. Nick's opening hand contains a Seagate Restoration, Force of Will, Ancient Tomb, Misty Rainforest, and his London Mulligans are Fierce Guardianship, Pact of Negation, and Necropotence. Next, we have our Mox Pearl patron Peter, piloting Kenrith, the Return King. This mid-range deck seeks to win with Thassa's Oracle, Underworld Breach, or Infinite Loops with its commander. Peter's opening hand contains a Mana Crypt, Fierce Guardianship, Mystic Remora, Underworld Breach, Dauthi Voidwalker, City of Brass, and Aristic Study. After that, we have Ashani, piloting Niv-Mizzet Perun. This deck seeks to control the table, gain advantage with its commander, and win with the Curiosity effect. Ashani's opening hand contains a Polluted Delta, Mana Confluence, Mana Crypt, Prismatic Vista, Misdirection, Gamble, and a Muddle the Mixture. Finally, we have Zach, piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Kraum Ludovic's Opus. This deck, called Blue Farm, seeks to grind advantage with its commanders before closing out the game with Underworld Breach or Thassa's Oracle. Zach's opening hand contains an Arid Mesa, Mox Diamond, Mystical Tutor, Simian Spirit Guide, Grim Tutor, Ristic Study, and a Brain Freeze. Without further ado, let's kick off this big bad bombastic borderline boast. Nick won the Blackout Challenge and gets to start us off. Nick draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Peter draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Ristic Study. In response, Nick casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Ristic. Peter passes. Ashani draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding City of Traders. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Ristic Study. Peter groans, Study resolves, and Zach ships the turn to Nick. At the end of Zach's turn, Nick cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Nick draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Imperial Seal. Ristic triggers, and Nick taps the City of Brass to pay for it. Then Nick fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Nick ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and then taps his City of Brass to help cast out Mystic Remora, paying the Ristic tax. Peter passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Gamble. Ristic and Mystic trigger, and Peter and Zach draw. Then Ashani fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Mana Confluence. He plays a City of Brass for turn. He taps it to help cast a Ristic Study of his own. Peter and Zach draw, then Ristic resolves. All through, Ashani passes. Zach draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Drannith Magistrate. Ristic triggers and Ashani draws. Drannith resolves and Zach ships the turn. Nick draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Ristic Study. Remora and 2 Ristics trigger, and all 3 players draw. The table straps in, and Nick passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also taps his City of Brass to pay for his Remora. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch. 3 Ristics trigger, Peter pays 2, and then Nick draws. With nothing else, Peter passes. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, plays a Mountain, and passes the turn. Zach draws and plays the City of Brass. Zach ends his turn. Nick draws and passes. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also pays to keep its Remora. He draws and taps the City of Brass to help cast Dauthi Voidwalker. 3 Ristics trigger, and all 3 players draw. Peter ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Nizzic's Signet. He pays for both Ristics, and Peter draws through Remora. Ashani passes. Zach draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver, and both players draw from Ristic. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Drannith Magistrate. Peter takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Zach gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and taps his City of Brass to help cast Counterbalance, Mystic, and 2 Rhystic's trigger, and all 3 players draw. In response, Peter casts Swansong and all 3 opponents draw again. Counterbalance is countered and exiled with a Void counter, and Nick creates a 2/2 bird. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He taps his Ancient Doom to help cast Talisman of Dominance, and all 3 opponents draw through Rhystic and Mystic. Finished up, Nick passes. During his upkeep, Peter lets his Remora die. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Grand Abolishers. All Rhystic's trigger, and all 3 opponents draw. In response, Ashani casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Zach's Rhystic. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Nick and Zach draw, then Zach's Rhystic is bounced. Then Abolisher resolves. Next, Peter casts Underworld Breach. He attempts to escape Mystic Remora, but Zach reminds him of the Drannith Magistrate on the battlefield. Peter sinks his head as he realizes what he just did. With nothing else to do, Peter passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an island. He casts Gilded Drake. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. In response, Nick cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast Drown in the Loch. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. In response, Ashani casts Muddle the Mixture, targeting Drown in the Loch. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. In response, Peter casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Gilded Drake. Rhystic's trigger and Nick and Ashani draw. Force counters Drake, then Muddle counters Drown. Next, Ashani casts Dockside Extortionist, and Nick draws from Rhystic. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 4 treasures. He casts Fabricate. Rhystic triggers, and Nick draws again. Then Ashani fetches up an Imposter Mech into his hand. He casts Imposter Mech, and Nick draws from Rhystic. Imposter Mech enters as a copy of Drannith Magistrate. He casts a Mox Amber, and Nick draws. Ashani passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Zach cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Mystical Tutor. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Ashani and Nick draw. Then Zach fetches up a Culling the Weak onto the top of his library. Ashani discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Tymna as an additional cost. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Ashani and Nick draw. In response, Peter pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep. Rhystic's trigger, and both draw again. In response, Zach casts Swansong, targeting Misstep. Rhystic's trigger, and both draw again. Swansong counters Misstep. Peter creates a 2/2 bird, then Culling the Weak resolves, and Zach adds 4 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Rhystic's trigger, and both players draw. In response, Nick casts Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers, and Ashani draws. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Ashani and Nick draw from Rhystic, and in response, Peter casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Ad Nauseam. Rhystic triggers, and both draw. Ad Naus is countered, and Force counters Pact. Next, Zach taps his City of Brass to help cast Rhystic Study. Nick and Ashani draw through Rhystic, Zach's Rhystic resolves, and Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Nick casts Limdul's Vault. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Zach and Ashani draw. He looks at the top 5, doesn't like what he sees, pays a life, and continues the process. He does this 2 more times, paying 2 more life, then shuffling and rearranging the top 5. He draws and plays a snow-covered island. He taps his City of Brass to help cast a Phantasmal Image. Rhystic trigger, and Zach and Ashani draw. In response, Ashani taps his City of Brass to help cast Stern Scolding. In response, Nick taps his Talisman to cast Spell Pierce, targeting Stern Scolding. Rhystic's trigger, and both draw again. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting all spells on the stack. Rhystic's trigger, and both players draw. All are exiled, then Nick follows up by casting Kraum Mox. Rhystic trigger, and both players draw. Kraum Mox enters, and Nick imprints Stern Scolding. He casts Mox Opal, and both draw again. He taps his Ancient Doom to cast an Arcane Signet, and both players draw from Rhystic. With nothing else, Nick passes, discarding the hand size into the Void Zone. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers, and all 3 players draw. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 12 treasures. He taps the City of Brass to cast Cyclonic Rift, targeting Ashani's Drannith. Rhystic triggers, and all players draw again. Imposter Mech bounces, and then Peter casts Mayhem Devil. Each player draws through Rhystic, and Mayhem Devil resolves. Peter cracks 3 treasures, floating mana. Mayhem Devil triggers 3 times, killing Zach's Drannith. He casts his commander, Kenrith, the Return King. He sacrifices Dothy Voidwalker, casting Zach's Culling the Weak from exile, sacrificing Phantasmal Image as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He activates Kenrith's last ability, Reanimating Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 12 more treasures. He cracks 2 treasures, adding 2 green. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Zach for 2. He activates Kenrith's second ability, targeting Phantasmal Dockside. It triggers, and Peter sacrifices it. Mayhem Devil triggers, and deals 1 to Ashani. Peter presents a loop of Reanimated Image, creating treasures through Dockside, then sacrificing it through Kenrith's ability. Each time he cracks a treasure or sacrifices Image, he pings opponents through Mayhem Devil. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a fun game. Congrats to Peter on his win. His early Rhystic Study was countered, and it really put him on the back foot for the entire match. Everyone else had their own Rhystic and he could not outdraw them. Through well-timed interaction and good knowledge of his deck, he was able to pull out the win tonight. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Grand Abolisher. I'm sure some of you might be thinking it should have gone to Rhystic Study. However, with all the cards drawn this game, they meant absolutely nothing in their hand due to Grand Abolisher. This creature allowed Peter to go off unimpeded, and no amount of Rhystic Study triggers were able to stop his combo win. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.